Okay, so our Great Pyramids of Egypt. I don't think you need to memorize the names, right, in order to get identification. I don't think you have to memorize those names. AP, the more and more I learn, the more flexible they are about some of this information, which is kind of nice. That way you don't have to, memorize how to spell things. But even when I was in college, we called these pyramids something different. It's like the English version of KHAFRE was KHAFRE. Like, so even I have different names. So like, depending on what your resource is, sometimes we call them different things, okay? So you have a plan. And so we haven't seen too many plans yet in our image set, but they will often give you what, like a plan or a layout. And so I think what they're getting at when they give you these kind of contextual images is that they're trying to get you to understand the layouts. So we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about layouts. Even when we get to the Mortuary Temple of HATSHEPSUT, we're really focused on how it's organized. Okay. So when we look at this plan, it tells us all the different parts that are included in these different funerary burial sites, right? So here's an aerial view, and I'll go back to the one you have too, right? And this is a recreation of what it looks like. Okay, so on this view, which you can't see here, this is the one that they give you for AP, right? What you can't see is that this is the Nile, right? So the Nile is a way of transporting the dead. It's very symbolic, right? And so boats are used symbolically to transport the bodies, physically as well as spiritually. So we often see images of the boats, and the boats were actually buried in these sites too. So there are lots of excavation sites where we see boats being buried into the ground. There's a series of pits by the SPHINX actually. And so when you go to this area next to the Nile, the first place that they would hit is this valley temple. So we have these valley temples. So the valley temples are where they prepared the body, right? It's where they prepared the body. So they might do some mummification there. That's where they did the embalming. They would put it in maybe its coffin, right? There would be special ceremonies and whatnot there. And then they would take and make an elevated platform. So that vertical or that long longitudinal area there would be an elevated platform. It'd be like a walkway, right? And you could have different pomp and circumstances there, right? You could transport the body from the funerary temple to, from the valley temple to the funerary temple, or take it to its final resting place in the tomb. You could also have different ceremonies, right? Because remember that once the pharaoh is dead, they're not gone. So you would celebrate them all the time. There'd be priests who live and work in this area all the time, and their whole job would be to actually serve the deceased pharaoh, right? Because the pharaoh still has power on earth. Their Ba is still around. So then also next to the pyramids, we have their funerary temple. And so that's the place where you might have the serdab and the room and festival halls and palaces and all the things that pharaoh would need, right, to continue in the lifestyle that they had on earth. That's where family members and priests and people could come to basically worship and honor the pharaoh or the king. Pharaoh is actually a term that doesn't come around until the New Kingdom, right? And it just basically means like a supreme throne, like a house that encompasses power. And then of course, the pyramids itself The tombs were all over. Some of them were under the ground, some of them were hidden inside. It depended on the ruler. And sometimes they had false tombs because, of course, there was a lot of tomb robbing, even relatively close to the burials, right? Because, of course, they buried all that cool stuff with it. So I should have switched to this while I was talking. So all the information that we just talked about is right here, right? So you guys probably all got this already, right? So Valley King, right, was used for embalming, or the Valley Temple, right? That's where they would actively worship, right? Actively worship the deceased king, right? Then they'd walk and lead processions to the Mortuary Temple. And then there, it too would hold cults to the dead king. People would also go there to hang out. And then the tomb would house the mummified body, the sarcophagus, the objects, the things, all the stuff that they would need. This is Tut, right? This is Tut, which is in Valley of the Kings, which we'll get to eventually. This is one of the storerooms, right? Kind of looks like your garage probably, or an attic. All of this stuff piled up. Okay. So let's go ahead and look at a video. I think I have to pause the recording. So if you're watching from home, you can go to this from the link. So when we look at the basic architecture, it still is very similar to a mastaba. And actually, if you look at the plan, there's a bunch of rectangular shapes. Those are still mastabas, right? So we're talking about a necropolis, a city for the dead, right? And so there's going to be other structures in that whole complex, which would be for officials, right? High-ranking members of family, right? And politics. And they all have similar elements to them. They might have those seraphs connected, they might have ramps, they might have walkways, they have the tomb space, and so on, right? So this is KHAFRE's Mortuary Temple. What kind of construction is this? Post and lintel, right? This is what we're going to see until we get to the Romans. The Romans will devise the arch, right? But mostly in the ancient world, we have post and lintel. So you can see sometimes it's red stone. And then when we have our, yeah. Yes, yeah. And then with this one, we have the image of the Sphinx in front of it. And so what's the function of the Sphinx? Like, why is there a Sphinx in front of KHAFRE's tomb? Yeah. Right, it's a guardian figure. Sphinxes are all over the place. We will have it at the Temple of Amun-Re. There's all these processional walkways, and there's a series of, I won't say hundreds, but like a ton of these little sphinx, right? Now this is just a colossal version of one. So this is KHAFRE's Sphinx. So this is KHAFRE in front of his pyramid. So he is a gigantic protector. So a sphinx is a composite animal. Besides the head of KHAFRE, the pharaoh, what is the body made of? What's his body an image of? A lion. And so a lion is a symbol of power. It's fierce, it's strong, it's a hunter. So it's a great representation for the ruler who protects his people, right? As well as protect them in the afterlife, right? When were the pyramids made? Before or before their death or after their death? Who are the patrons for the pyramids? Any guess? Do you think KHAFRE had anything to do with putting a giant sphinx in front of his tomb? He did. They built them during their own lifetime. because they were preparing for their afterlife, right? Because it's not like it's the end of their reign. They need to reign forever and ever. So here you can see there's some speculation that his head might have been a part of something before, maybe another ruler. And one of the reasons is his head is relatively small for the size of his body. And so they have reconstructed what the legs probably look like. So you can really see, especially from this point of view, how enormous his paws were. He lost his nose, like in maybe the late 1800s from shooting practice. I think some army was shooting at the face and broke off his nose. So it lasted for like almost 5,000 years before it was damaged. Right, here's an aerial view of it. So all of this part has been reconstructed. This is not how it was found. And so here you can see this is KHAFRE, a seated sculpture of KHAFRE. Some people think it's Ka sculpture, but really we're not quite sure. But you can see the similar profile, similar headdress. Right? And then MENKAURA's tomb, or his pyramid, is made out of red stone, so it's got a slightly different color to it, and it's the smaller of the three. He was KHAFRE's son, I believe, and this is his, right? So remember we already looked at this with like images of power. This was found in the complex. This was found in the Mortuary Temple. So that little itty bitty sculpture I showed you. Okay. So let's go ahead and continue looking at images of power. And so we're going to zip through the middle kingdom. There's no images for the middle kingdom, but I think it's important to kind of look at a few. The rulers are a little different. This is an image of Senusret II. When you look at how he's portrayed, is there anything that stands out to you that might tell us what the Middle Kingdom was like? Look at his face. I'm going to suggest that you look at his eyes. Does he look as idealized as KHAFRE does? No. The Middle Ages is kind of a time of turmoil. We have these very powerful Old Kingdom pharaohs. You know, they had those gigantic pyramids built. And then they said, you know, they stopped sort of building them eventually because there was less resources and so on. So a lot of these guys were probably like military leaders and saw a lot of hardship. And so it's kind of interesting that there's a sense of realism to them as well, because he kind of has sunken eyes. You see wrinkles on his forehead. You guys see that? And then, of course, his image has been destroyed a little bit as well. So we've got some images of Senusret the first, second, third, right? And so burial practices sort of changed at this time too. So we have, instead of building pyramids, they started to make rock cut tombs. And this is something that continued in the New Kingdom, right? So we had mastabas in the Old Kingdom and rock cut tombs in the New. So what we will see that they start to do is, instead of constructing, they basically are deconstructing, right? They're going to carve into a cliff, right? And they would often have things like columns. And then so this is like the area where you'd see imagery of the king and the pharaoh, and them as the hunter, and them living their lives. And then into the dark area of the cliff is where we would protect the body in the tomb, right? And so there was a series of these during the Middle Ages, right? So that leads us not to a tomb, but to the Mortuary Temple of HATSHEPSUT, right, during the New Kingdom. So in the New Kingdom, almost all of the burial spots of the king and the queen are going to be on the west side of the Upper Egypt. So we're talking very far south. You know, Old Kingdom was in the north. New Kingdom is in the south. So the Valley of the Kings. Most of the pharaohs were buried there. The Valley of the Queens was for their wives. Okay. So we have two images for the Mortuary Temple of Hatshepsut. We have her mortuary temple. So this is not her tomb. This is her tomb would be cut into the cliff somewhere else. This would be like on the Nile, right? There'd be an elevated platform and then there would be a structure. This is that structure. So she is not buried here. That's important to know, right? She would be buried in the Valley of the Kings, which we'll talk about in a little bit, right? And then we also have a sculptural representation of this female pharaoh, right? So you'll have two note takers for this. What I would suggest that you do is on one page, talk just about the temple. On the other page, talk about the sculpture. You probably don't need to rewrite all the contextual information. You'll see that I started editing these things eventually. Basically, these note takers were created by another teacher first, and then I created the other half of them based on her format. I started to edit things like this away. So if you want to do the first page on the temple and the second one on the sculpture, you can do that. You can like X out the sculpture on the first page so that you remember you're only writing about the temple. That would be a good idea. So we're going to watch a TED production on Hatshepsut. I'm going to go ahead and pause the Zoom again because of copyright. Okay, so who was she, right? Who are you going to say she was? What are you going to say she was? Speak up, please. Yes. She was a regent. So she basically co-ruled with her stepson, who was very, very young, right? So in essence, she was a female pharaoh. There were obviously, you've heard of Cleopatra. There were other female pharaohs. I think there was a total of 4. She was probably one of the more successful ones of them. And so, 7. There were 7 female pharaohs. And so she gained her power after the death of her husband, right? And she basically ruled for 20 years. We know she was a great builder, and the evidence is your image, right? The Funerary Temple, the Mortuary Temple of Hatshepsut, she commissioned it, had that built during her lifetime, right? And even before, like I was saying, they were saying, like, we've been researching her for a while. Even before we knew it was made for a female pharaoh, this was, and this still is, and you'll see images of it, what a very impressive mortuary temple. Very impressive, okay? She was a military ruler, right? She traded. We know information about her. It's been documented, okay? So this is the plan. You don't have the plan, but I think it's important to understand what these structures are like. So it is an axial temple. Do you remember when we looked at the white temple, we called it bent axis? And so basically it's like I walk straight and then I turn and I go 90-degree angles, right? This is pretty typical, right? This is like a church. This is like a Greek temple. There's normally like an entryway and you kind of walk straight through it, right? So this is in the form of an axial temple. Their temples to the gods were also in this format. So we'll see this again tomorrow, okay? It also has hypostyle halls. Now, you remember at Persepolis with Darius and Xerxes? Hypostyle hall? Does anyone know which part of this is a hypostyle hall? Yes.
The part of top of the columns.
Exactly. A hypostyle hall is rooms held up by columns. So all those little circles here and here are all supporting the weight of the ceiling, right? So those are your hypostyle halls. Good. Right? So this is very similar to your image in the image set. Okay, so what's the function of a mortuary temple? It has the same function as when we looked at the Great Pyramid, right? Nothing has changed. So it's a funerary temple. These temples were designed to commemorate the reign of the pharaoh, right? So this talked about her. This talked about her greatness, what she did, all that visual information about how she was a good military leader, how she was a trading partner, her exhibitions to Nubia. They're all images inside the funerary temple. There would be cults, there would be priests, there would be people who would come to worship her after her death. There are also other temples here, right? So temples to other gods. So once again, please, 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 please remember, this is not her tomb. Her tomb was a quarter of a mile away in the Valley of the Kings. This is like located by the Valley of the Kings. So her tomb, like all the other guys, would be a rock cut tomb into the cliffside. This is a rock cut temple, okay, not a tomb. So this is the aerial view of the layout of this. Not all of it is actually hers. If you look, hers is the part that's over here on the right. And then the temple to her, does that say third? Yes, third. The temple to her son, right, who she was a regent for, his is actually right next to it. But notice it's a little smaller than hers, right? And then there's a temple to another leader on the side. So there's 3 pharaohs' funerary temples here, but there's also temples and chapels to other gods. So there's a chapel of Hathor. Remember Hathor on the palette of Namar, right? She's the goddess of like fertility, which sort of makes sense for a female pharaoh, right? So we have her connected there. So when we look at the plan and we look at this recreation, you really get a feel for what it's like to experience it, okay? So I have this on another slide, but I think I want to use this one as we go. I'm walking, right? I'm here, and then look at a bunch of Sphinx, right? Just like we saw at the pyramid. And what's around me as I'm walking? What is that? What's the green stuff? What's the green stuff? It's a garden, right? It's a garden. What does that symbolize to me? In this arid place, there's a garden. What does that symbolize to me? What do you think? Yeah. Life and vitality, fertility, abundance, right? Abundance. And so there's this beautiful, large space for me to understand how even in this dry, humid, like arid place, there is life, right? And HATSHEPSUT has the ability to create that. Then I'm walking on the flat earth, and then I start to walk up a ramp, right? That ramp could have been used for ceremonial purposes, right? As well as transportation from the ground up to the next level. What do I encounter once I walk up there? What's this? What do you think we did up there? Yeah.
Like festivals and large gatherings.
Exactly. Large areas for people to come and commemorate her, right? And then we have another walkway. And then we get to a smaller platform. And then we get to those hypo-style halls, right? So really kind of cool to think about is, and we talked about this at the White Temple. I'm outside, it's bright, it's sunny, it's like vegetation. I walk up this ramp, kind of cool. Then I walk up to this open area and there's all these people. And then I walk inside. And how does the mood change? It's no longer bright and sunny anymore. It's dark, right? It's dark. So it's inside the cliff, it's dark. And there's going to be images and sculptures of her all over the place. So it's like I'm walking into like a more sacred place. So that there's an active change. And so what you're going to see is there's those hypo-style halls. There's a smaller, more secluded gathering space. Not everyone got to go inside, right? Normally, inner chambers of things are just like there for like the most social elite, right? So priests, family members are going to get to go to those innermost places. Now, this is the part where people are always like, oh, it's a tomb. This is not a tomb. These are other chapels to gods, right? But they're in the most sacred part, like in the heart of the cliff. Okay, so this is all underneath the cliff here, built into the cliff. So here you can see his the son, right? He had a pyramid on top of his. There's the Ben stone at the top. See how it's kind of like the gold? Right? So here is our elevated courtyards, ceremonial ramps, what it's like to walk up there. So still very impressive. So even before we knew it was for a female, right? People really love this structure, right? So there would be giant images of the pharaoh, giant images of the pharaoh. Can you see? Like as if they're columns, post and lintel architecture, right? And so inside this chamber here, this is where we have different chapels. So the function of this is not just to show her greatness, right? And to honor her, but it also honors other people. It honors Hathor, Anubis, Hatshepsut herself. It also, the most sacred is Sanctuary of Amun. Amun is the sun god, the most supreme god. And when we move to the temple of Amun-Ra, right, that is dedicated to the supreme sun god, the one that rules over all the other gods, right? So it would make sense to have, right, to have temples to all these other people. So the last thing that we have is the Mortuary Temple sculpture. What is she doing? What is she doing? What's her posture? Exactly. So this was a sculpture dedicated to one of those other gods, right? And I know that it's her in, like her kind of showing herself as modest to a supreme being because of that kneeling. So she is a pharaoh. And what emblems tell us that she's a pharaoh? The headdress. She's got the Means headdress. She's got the fake beard, right? She's got the fake beard on that the male pharaohs wore. She's got no shirt on and she's wearing a kilt. She's shown as male, right? She's shown as male and she's holding vessels in her hands. Those are probably votives, offerings to the gods, maybe anointed oil, something like that, right? So the function of this is that it was part of a processional decoration as an offering to the gods. And so this sculpture was probably in this temple right here that was dedicated to the sun god, to Amun-Ra, right? And later it was taken to another location. So this is like a guesstimate of where it went. There's a Smart History article I'm sure most of you watched that has some more information on this. So it would be one of a series, by the way, not just one, right? There would be a number of these images of her, right? So central needs to go. So I just wanted to make sure that I showed you guys on the way out all the different ways she was represented. Just like any other pharaoh, we have her seated, like the KHAFRE that we saw. We have her as a sphinx. We have her as kind of like columns, right? We have her as male, even more male here. Here she's got the lower Egyptian bowling white crown, right? And then we also have the images carved into the walls. So this is Anubis there, the jackal, right? But we have images of her painted and carved in relief on the walls. Okay, so we're going to focus on the Temple of Amun-Ra tomorrow. Bye, everyone.